So just a quick reminder, external validity, which is ultimately what we're talking about when we're referring to generalizability, is how the outcome of a study can ultimately then be applied to the larger population from which the samples used in the study were derived, or how well the outcome of a study can be applied or generalized to different contexts. Some additional terms: populations of interest are ultimately any group that the study's conclusions are intended to be applied to, And this is defined by the researchers when they are coming up with the studies or experiments that they're going to run, and is a little bit different than the general use of the term population. So when we're just generally using the word population, we mean every single individual of a certain class. So the population of human beings would be every single human being that exists on the planet. But we're not always interested in making conclusions about all human beings on the planet. For example, we could be interested in just people who watch Netflix. And so here our population of interest would be all individuals who watch Netflix, not all human beings. And so ultimately populations of interest are defined by the researchers' criteria of whatever it is that they're interested in studying and who they're interested in studying it in. The other term that fits along with populations are samples, and these are any subgroup that is derived from a population of interest and that is actually used in a study. So when we are reading about some data that is used in an experiment, this is always coming from a sample, and we are almost always using our information from a sample to make conclusions about the entire population of interest. So there are, of course, two different types of samples that are possible. These are, well, I guess there are many different types of samples, but they would fall into two different classes. You would either have biased samples or unbiased samples. And ideally what we aim to have is an unbiased sample, at least for those cases where it matters, which we will talk about in the second lecture set. So for a sample to be considered unbiased, two conditions must be satisfied. First, and as silly as this may sound, the sample must be drawn from the population of interest. So for example, if I was interested in all the individuals who identify as females experience in Iran, I could not ask individuals who identify as female in the United States of America along whatever the metrics I was interested in and then generalize to those individuals living in Iran, because their contexts are different, and in this case ultimately the populations of interest themselves are different because I'm interested in a specific group of people living in a specific geographical location. And so when using samples, they must be drawn from the population of interest if you would like to make conclusions using the data from a sample to apply or infer to that population of interest. Sorry, just continuing on there. Again, like I said, while this might sound like something that is completely obvious, one does find a lot in psychology, even though less so now that the focus on cross-cultural perspectives, for example, is getting more widely available. It is surprising how many times experiments are conducted or studies are conducted on a very small subset of individuals, and this is then generalized far beyond what that sample allows one to generalize to. So as trivial as this may seem, it is actually something that comes up fairly often. The second thing that must be satisfied in order for a sample to be considered unbiased is that sample must be obtained in a probabilistic fashion. And what we mean by this is ultimately that the individuals who are going to be used in the sample, be it humans or non-humans or inanimate objects, are randomly selected from the population of interest that we're curious to learn more about. And we will now, over the next several slides, talk about different forms of random sampling. Now, just for terminology, unbiased samples are also often referred to as representative samples, and biased ones are referred to oftentimes as unrepresentative samples. Now, whenever the above conditions or these previous two that I mentioned are not met, our sample would be considered biased. Now, When a sample is biased, it compromises external validity because what we're saying is this sample does not adequately reflect the population of interest, and so any data that we derive from that sample is unlikely to match that of the entire population of interest. Even though that is not always the case, and there are degrees and situations where it matters more than others, but again, we'll talk about that in the second lecture set. So probably the theoretically purest form of obtaining an unbiased sample is the use of simple random sampling. And this would just be a situation in which every single individual in a population of interest has an equal chance of being present in the study itself. Now, while this is probably the ideal way of going about it, in practical situations, this is next to impossible to actually achieve. So let's say I wanted to know after somebody eats a pint, okay, not a pint of ice cream, let's say after somebody tries a new flavor of ice cream, they give ratings on a scale of 1 to 7 about how much they like this new flavor of ice cream. If I wanted a truly random sample of all people to evaluate how much they like this ice cream, I would have to give all 7.5 or 8 billion humans across this planet an equal opportunity to be present in my study, which practically speaking is next to impossible. Because first of all, we just don't even have information about every single individual on the planet, let alone the funding to fly people from all across the world to come and eat this ice cream or to send the ice cream to all of these individuals. In all of those cases, it's just impractical to actually have a true simple random sample. That being said, we will talk about several derivatives of this that are easier to obtain and maintain this use of randomness and thus allow us to have externally valid samples. Now, please remember that in research contexts or just in science at large, when we're talking about randomness, what we're talking about is just a lack of some kind of identifiable or consistent pattern, not something that is strange or out of the ordinary, which is how it's often used in colloquial language. So the first two that we'll talk about are cluster and multi-stage sampling. Multistage just being a subset or a modification of cluster sampling. So cluster sampling refers to a probability sampling technique, meaning it's based on randomness, in which clusters of participants within the whole population of interest are selected ultimately at random, the clusters, not the individuals, and then the data is collected from all individuals within those clusters that are selected. So for example, if I was interested in the yield of apple trees, I could select 10 farms across the United States, let's say, if that's what I was interested in. Of all the farms that grow apples, I could randomly select 10 of them, and then I would measure the yield of all apple trees within those 10 farms. Here, the 10 farms would be my clusters, and I would be measuring all individuals within those clusters. Now, multi-stage sampling just refines this or adds an additional layer of randomness. Not that one is better than the other, they're just oftentimes used in different contexts. So multi-stage sampling is ultimately the equivalent of cluster sampling, except instead of measuring all individuals within a cluster, one then randomly selects individuals from the clusters that also have been randomly selected. For example, in this case of using the apple trees and orchards, if I had those 10 random apple orchards that I had selected randomly from all orchards in the country, and then within those orchards, I randomly selected 50 apple trees from each orchard and measured their yield. Now, multi-stage sampling can have even more levels than just 2. For example, if I'm using this idea of apples and apple trees, if I was interested in the taste of apples, I could select 10 farms across the entire country randomly. Within each of those farms, I could select randomly 50 trees, and from those 50 trees, I could randomly select 20 apples. And in this way, I could have multiple stages at which each place or at each stage, I'm randomly selecting a subset of individuals. This is ultimately referred to as multi-stage sampling. Another form of random sampling that comes up actually quite a bit is stratified random sampling. And this is a random sampling technique in which the researcher identifies particular demographic categories. So this could be stuff like race, ethnicity, gender identification, location, income, these types of things. Also referred to as strata, or strata you can just think of as like the layers of a rock. Excuse me for being distracted. Anyway, so you identify these particular strata, and then you randomly select individuals from within each of these categories. So for example, if I wanted to know about individuals across the United States, but I was concerned that people with different racial or ethnic backgrounds would respond differently, what I could do is ensure that my sample had the same ultimate distribution as individuals of this entire population living in the United States of America. So for example, if currently, I believe the estimate is about 12.6 to 13% of all individuals in the United States identify as African American, that in a stratified random sample, I would aim to have about 13% of my sample identify as African American if I was interested in this particular demographic difference of race and ethnicity. Now, it should be mentioned here that when using this type of sampling, it is possible to have the sort of subsets or strata within those samples themselves result in an underpowered situation where one can no longer calculate the statistics in a meaningful and reliable way on those subsets. It would be possible to apply the statistics to the entire group, but it would not necessarily speaking be appropriate to do the same type of statistical analyses on those subsets. Now, one way to deal with this would be to ensure that whichever subset or strata comprise the smallest proportion of the total population, you aim to have enough individuals within that particular group such that it could now be powered. And by that, I just mean that when you run your conclusions through a statistical model, that it's likely that that is something that you can repeat over and over, as opposed to something that will give drastically different results when measured again. Now, that can oftentimes lead to situations where you have impractically large sets of samples. For example, if I have individuals who identify, let's say, as type C people, whatever that is, I don't think that's a real thing, and there's only 0.1% of all individuals who identify as type C people. What I would need to do is to have thousands and thousands of individuals in all other classes to ensure that I at least had 100 or 200 or so to achieve statistical power in this type C demographic, whatever that happened to be. And so that can result in situations where your samples are unwieldy or just immensely large or impractical to fund that type of research. In order to deal with this, we often use something called oversampling. And here, one identifies the specific demographic criteria or strata that you're interested in measuring across, and instead of trying to match them appropriately to what exists in the population at large, you just make sure that each subset or demographic category has enough individuals within them such that they're statistically powered even in those subsets. Of course, this will make it seem, at least in the sample, that all different demographic categories are equally represented in the population, which is rarely the case in the real world itself. Now, one other form of sampling is systematic sampling. I personally have not seen this used very much in types of research, but the place where I have actually seen this come up a whole bunch is in the United States when teachers and professors are making groups for group work in a classroom. And the way this works is when they have students count off. You have students count off by a certain series of numbers, and all the individuals of certain numbers come paired together. And so the way this would work for sampling is, let's say I identify the number 15, and then I open up a phone book. I start somewhere randomly in the middle, and then every 15th individual in the phone book I include in my study. And this would be a form of systematic sampling. Now, before we get into bias samples, it is important to note that you are not limited to using only one of these techniques and can combine them in different ways. And this is actually something one will commonly see in actual research because each confers different benefits and sometimes is more practically usable depending on what it is you actually happen to be measuring. Another thing that comes up a lot is weighting. A lot of this gets done on the statistical side of things, and what this refers to is a way to compensate specifically for when sample sizes are unequal. So for example, if I have different degrees of people who identify as male and female in my sample, I can numerically adjust for those differences so that I can make more accurate conclusions about all individuals, regardless of whether they identify as male or female. Further, this can also be used when groups contribute differently to a total. So that's something that one often sees in grades. So for example, you could have several assignments over the course of a semester, and each is graded out of 100 points, but they contribute differently to your final grade. The manner in which they contribute differently are ultimately referred to as the weights. And this can ultimately be used in modifying or adjusting when a sample does not either accurately represent the entire population of interest, or more commonly, when it accurately represents the population of interest, but certain now subsets or cells within those demographic categories are underpowered and thus not amenable to statistical analysis. When it comes to bias samples, probably the most common one that comes up are convenience samples or convenient sampling, and this is just choosing samples based on those individuals who are easiest to access or are readily available. So while this is not always a problem, and we'll talk about that more in the next set of slides, this is something that most psychological literature ultimately suffers from, because most psychological literature over, let's say, the last 50 years has been conducted on psychology students who are the easiest samples available to people doing psychological research, because most people who do psychological research are also teaching psychology, and the people most readily available to them are students to whom they can give stuff like extra credit. And so in many ways, much of the whole psychological literature is based on convenient sampling. And sometimes this can be highly problematic, other times not so much. You can look up the acronym WEIRD, and I believe this refers to Western educated, industrialized, rich and demographic countries, and that most research of psychology at least has been conducted on these individuals, and thus is not readily applicable to groups or cultures that do not fit with that template. Now, a subset, or maybe even a more extreme form of this, is purposive sampling. And this is a convenient sampling technique that results in only a certain kind of individual being selected for a sample. So for example, if I was interested in teachers' experiences at university, but I myself worked in the math department, and I only went to math faculty to ask how they were feeling about teaching, this would be an example of purposive sampling, where one, I just went and found whoever was easy, other people in my department, but two, I only asked people in my department, and so there's no way to know if that is representative of all other departments that exist across the university. Another form of convenient sampling is referred to as snowball sampling. This gets used a lot in sexuality research, for example, and this is where you find several participants, and at the end of their participation, you ask them to recommend other people that they know who are within the same category as them, or maybe niche would be a way to say it if you wanted to go that route. And you ask them to recommend other people that they know who would satisfy the criteria or requirements for a study, and then ask them to participate, and then you do the same with them, and so on and so forth, and ultimately you build a tree of individuals who will all contribute. But of course, note that that is not actually a random sample. The other type of bias sample that comes up a lot, and this is what one overwhelmingly sees when one is looking at the information of polls and surveys that you come across on social media websites or the internet at large, and this refers to self-selection bias. And that is a form of sampling bias that occurs when you have a sample of individuals who are individuals who volunteered to participate. So stuff like reviews on Amazon or something like this would be a form of self-selection bias, because it is only the people who actually choose to write a review of some kind who are actually present in the sample that you're using. Now, this can sometimes be a problem and other times not. The main thing that is important there is, do people who volunteer have some kind of systematic difference from people who do not volunteer, and is that systematic difference relevant to whatever conclusions we're trying to make? We'll talk about this some more on the next set of slides, but really, or ideally, what one is hoping to go for is that your sample is as unbiased as possible, because it will allow you to make the best type of conclusions from your sample to the population at large. One last distinction to make. So random sampling is all about obtaining samples. It's how you get your sample, and that you're doing it in some kind of probabilistic way. And ultimately, random sampling applies to all forms of studies, be them related to frequency claims, association claims, or causal, doesn't matter. This is the gold standard of how you would go about getting a sample. Random assignment refers only to experiments, and it is specifically talking about placing participants into the conditions of an experiment in a random fashion. Now, this is done to ensure internal validity, random assignment, whereas random sampling is done to ensure external validity. All studies make or get benefit from random sampling. Experiments, however, are the only ones that use random assignment, but they also do benefit from random samples. Ideally, in an experiment, you have a random sample that you randomly assign to the conditions within the experiment.